We are live with Memorex here and Madame Deb in Paris. This is part 2 of a two-part show I'm calling Serial Killers and Their Eras, plural, because it seems like there's more than one era sometimes at the serial killer. So this is a second part of a I said an outsized topic, a big topic. So many murders, so many theories, and so many facts and data, and all the rest of it. So this is part 2, and I think in this part we're going to start with you, Deb, because you live in France, and you know a lot about French society and culture, and part of that, I suppose, is murder and crime in France.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you want to talk about the serial killer phenomenon if it's in France? And then we'll go talk about some other things.
Well, there is not much of a serial killer phenomenon here. And that's why the ones that exist stand out so much.
Okay.
I think in the US, you could probably list hundreds at this point. You've got your well-known ones that get all of the attention, and you've got hundreds and hundreds of other, like, technically serial killers. But a lot of the time, I think somebody who gets the label of serial killer slapped on him, technically he's a serial killer because he's killed 3 or more people, but in a series, not in a one go or anything. But those cases tend to be like less interesting. I hate to say it, but people have a kind of a bloodthirst and a fascination with the gory and the creepy and the unusual, which is why the Dahmers and the Bundys stand out so much. So I think France is so different because, first of all, it's a much smaller country geographically.
Oh yeah.
Just the geography of this country is nothing like the States. And I think we have an abundance of serial murderers in the US, largely because geographically it's easier, especially for transient killers who are able to kind of move about. You can. We're a car culture. We're a much more car-based culture. Yeah. And weirdly, the most famous serial killer cases in France, a couple of which are, were set right here in Paris, these did not involve so much like, driving around in cars. So I think the dynamic is so different when you're confined to like a village, such as the case of like Henri Landru, who you might know the name because Charlie Chaplin made a film about this case.
Oh, okay.
Claude Chabrol made a film about Landru. I'll talk about him more in a minute. But, usually in the States, you've got I think serial killers tend to be more suburban based or semi-rural or kind of interstate.
I'm going to add to that, and I guess amen to that, because studying this phenomenon of serial killer for our podcast Journey of an Aesthete, the thing that stuck out were the vehicles. Everything's about the van, the sports car, the truck, the cars, all, car after car. There's so much of this story is a story of these lone males traveling from state to state, from town to town in their cars and using their cars to get away. And whether it's Bundy or Bedecker and that van and all the two men in the really awful things to those young women in that van, Hillside. I mean, it's all about the car, and that was a later realization on my part. I didn't, because I'm not a car-oriented person. I'll first think of cars when I get up in the morning. But of course,
right? No, it's true.
Actually, so it's more than suburbs. It's actually the story of the serial killer is a story of people in men in their automobiles, and I think, right?
A lot of the time, there's cars involved. Just as an aside, a hailstorm just started up here. We're
Okay.
having some very strange tropical weather. So if my connection drops,
Oh,
I'll message you and we'll reconnect.
okay.
And I hope the noise isn't interfering with the
Oh,
sound.
I don't hear anything. No noise.
Okay, good. The hail is hitting the windows pretty hard right now. Okay, so often there's a car involved, whether it is somebody who's going from one state to another, because you've got American serial killers who were truck drivers who, you know, that was a really easy cover for them. You're going from state to state, from, you know, just one truck stop to the next one, or one, you know, 7-Eleven to the next. And it's really hard to track that.
That's right.
And often the victims are runaways,
Right.
sex workers, people,
Yeah.
you know, women nobody's looking for, unfortunately,
Right.
you know, women who don't get missed very much, you know. And then you've got, you know, up in, you know, Alaska, you had a serial killer up there, and I can't remember what his name was, but he was another one that, you know, he just kind of went, the geographic area in which he operated was quite massive, and it involved a highway or a road, or, you know, something like that. So what I've noticed about serial killer stories in these European countries, there are some that are more focused in a rural area, but
Right.
there's this handful of fascinating cases that have taken place in either Paris or between Paris and another French city or village. And I'm throwing one in today that's actually Belgian,
Okay.
French-speaking Belgian. I'll talk
Right.
about that later. And I will explain to you how I believe that case ties into the Epstein
Oh,
that's
okay.
happening right now.
All right.
Okay, so where would you like to start, Mitch?
I'm going to leave that up to you because you're an expert on this. I know. Really,
I don't know if I'm an expert.
No, I just do not know anything about France and the killers there, really.
Okay.
Got it. So I mean,
you know, France is a country of a number of major cities and then a number of smaller cities, and in between you've got lots and lots of rural and semi-rural communities,
okay.
a lot of countryside, and then a lot of also bedroom communities, which would be kind of closer to our suburbs. So when we talk about the suburbs, like if we talk about the Parisian suburbs, it's nothing like the American suburbs. Parisian suburbs are going to have some kind of infrastructure with regards to public transport, shopping, restaurants, you know, just all that kind of stuff. Because even though people do drive cars here, of course, a lot of French people still prefer to have the option of walking out the door, walking to the marché to buy their groceries, walking to the boulangerie to buy their bread. So you just have different kinds of ways of life here. But one thing that they all have in common, like even though the French have cars, and some people are car-based kind of by necessity, because if you live out in these rural areas and you work in some kind of agriculture or in a factory that's set in a rural area, you really don't have the option. This is what the whole Gilets jaunes movement was about some years back. It was really, it started out being about the high prices of gas.
That's right.
It was really affecting these people who live in these rural and semi-rural communities who have professions that keep them tethered to that land, basically.
Right.
So now the reason I think there are not many, you know, looking through the annals of French crime, the reason I think I couldn't find too many rural-based serial killers, if any at all, you know, there's a bit of crossover, is because within these rural communities and semi-rural communities, there's a lot of everybody knows everybody. And I can tell you that from experience, because my in-laws, my husband's family has a home near Toulouse, which is the south of France. Their home is actually like a bit north of that, but it's in a rural mountainous community, and absolutely everyone knows everyone. It always blows my mind when I go to the like Sunday market with my mother-in-law. Absolutely everybody knows everybody. It's almost impossible to have like any kind of a private life. People, there's some kind of even though in her little village, it's fewer than 100 people live in this village.
Right.
You even know the people down in the next village and the next village. And when you have the Sunday market, everybody kind of bands together to go to the market or to church to see either you're going to mass or you're seeing like a choral concert or something like that. It just always astonishes me how close these communities are.
Right.
You think of the French, because I live in Paris.
Right.
It's really different here. Here, the vibe with Parisians is, I'll leave you alone, you leave me alone. Respect my space, respect my right to quiet enjoyment. We'll meet up at the bars and the restaurants and when it's social time. But other than that, you kind of leave people alone here. You don't walk you don't walk down the street and randomly say hello to people. It's very different once you leave Paris and go out to these more, villagey rural places. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the case of Henri Landru. He was active in the early 1900s.
Oh, okay.
So we're going way, way back. You have to go really far back to find an interesting serial killer case. Now there have been others. For example, there was one during the I think this guy was active actually during the late 1800s. Joseph Vacher. They called him the French Ripper, and he did operate in a rural part of southeastern part of France. But his, I think the thing about this killer is that it's hard to understand what his motives were. He killed kind of everybody. He killed sheep farmers and farmers and kids, and he got compared to Jack the Ripper because of the use of the knife. But it's hard to understand what his motives were. He was eventually executed by guillotine. Then there was Rémi Roy, which he only killed 3 people. That was an interesting case because that was the early 1900s. That was early 1990s, and this involved kind of the gay scene and the BDSM scene, and him kind of like, so there's a bit of a Jeffrey Dahmer vibe going on there, but and he used. This guy actually was maybe the first on record in France to have used technology in some way to lure victims, because he used a French chat program called Minitel. He got life in prison, and he was caught after 3 victims. But these 3 victims were killed in a very short period of time, like a year. And I think for sure if they hadn't caught him, we would have seen much higher numbers. So I think that the police did a very good job in this case, and which they don't always do. And then
so hold that thought. So we're going to get back to the I'm just trying to keep track. So many killers.
There's so many. Yeah.
Your major person you mentioned, we're going back to them, right?
I'm gonna go back to Landru, because I think he
1912, around the time of the Great War, the First World War.
Exactly. It was the time of the First World War, and I do need to look down at my notes because I did a bunch of research on this one, and I really had no idea what the extent of his crimes were. Right. So he came from a fairly normal, kind of a seemingly normal family childhood background. And you and I have talked before about the childhood of all of these killers. There's usually something really messed up.
There's always
something. And even though it might not be obvious with him, his mother was, I think, a laundress. His father was a chauffeur, so not no like big money making jobs.
Right.
But somehow Landru became a grandiose person.
Mm.
He was a compulsive liar. He really liked to present himself as being a man of means, a man of wealth, a man of, distinction and culture. And he was absolutely none of those things. So he was based pretty much in Paris, but he also had a house that he rented in another town called Gombe, and it was in that house that most of the horrors took place. Although his operations spanned Paris to there, so he's kind of not. You could almost think of him in a way as like the Tinder killer of his time. Because he lured women using romance and promises of marriage and love. And so he was apparently very charming. Women, or at least women, found him charming. You could say that the women that he made as his mark found him very charming. He had a very
in that one sense identical to Ted Bundy, who there's a very similar in
right.
Bundy's that had great appeal. Certainly to Anne Rule, certainly to many women.
I don't, and I'm trying to think of like what does it mean to come across as charming to women in that era? Because if you look at pictures,
well, it would be different in 1920. Right.
Yeah, then early 1900s, you looking at pictures of him. I'm like, oh, he's nothing to look at to me. Unlike Bundy, Landru played a bit of a long game because he didn't just lure. His motive was very different from Bundy's, as far as we know. His motive was.
I mean, one thing I can tell you, putting aside the question of motive, is that this was a time for France. This is an important time for France culturally, as we know, right? Because this is the time of Proust's novel. This is the time of the explosion in Impressionism. This is the time of contribution to concert music and Debussy and Ravel. So it's interesting that this crime is occurring right when the spotlight's on France, I think.
Right. So again, I'm gonna give you some, context, some historical context though, with regards to the high arts, books by Proust and music by Debussy, like these things are still, I think even today, they're furthermore like cultured, intellectual. I hate to use the term elite, but these are not, figures that had wide, that have ever had like wide popularity with the country folk. Do you know what I mean? And that's why I always want to
talking about significance out. So in other words,
culturally, this is a time when it's still kind of teetering on that Belle Epoque era.
Right.
So it's culturally a very important time. That's really for sure.
Yeah,
but keeping in mind again. All of those French people, writers and composers and artists and filmmakers, they're significant in some sense. But when you go out of the big cities, when you leave Paris, when you leave, Bordeaux, when you leave like the big cities, the centers of culture, you find that people are a lot less interested in that stuff. Like, I can tell you even today. And I think
more so today.
Yeah, I think back in the in the early 1900s, you would have found that if you left the city, you would find some culture. You would still find, yes, people like to read books because especially before the age of TV and radio, the only kind of entertainment you have is books. But the French tend to be they're social creatures. They would have enjoyed going to the local bar and just drinking and hanging out and having conversations.
Right.
So, it's true. And probably the women that he was meeting probably would have been involved in the arts and culture somehow because he was meeting wealthy women.
Oh, okay.
He was looking for women of means.
Right.
So this is why I say, okay, there's a sort of, to try to give it some modern framing. Nowadays, you've got Tinder and Hinge and, what all of these, Match.com. And we know that there are always going to be ne'er-do-wells using these platforms to to
to
trap
predict.
people. Now, not necessarily, of course, most people aren't trying to trap somebody for either a financial scam or to kill them or, for anything like that. But a lot of the time, there's kind of a low key kind of a
Right.
scam, if you want to call it, where, okay, there's a friend of mine said to me, I
Yeah.
remember this expression that this woman said to me once. She said, men perform sex, or no, men perform love to get sex, and
Right.
women perform sex to get love. I think it's reductive, but I can see the kind of
Oh,
truth
sure.
in that. 'Cause, I can tell you, I know lots of women, and myself included, we've all met guys on dating sites that
Yeah.
just wanted sex, but pretend they're looking for a relationship.
Right.
Um, so, and I'm sure the reverse is true too, that there are women who are looking for relationships who pretend that they just want sex and they're using that as an avenue to a relationship. And it's very easy for people to be dishonest on these
Sure.
platforms. So Landreau, he didn't have Tinder.
Right.
He had newspapers, he had other ways of meeting people, going out to cafes and just seeing, does that lady look, well heeled? Does she look like she might be a good mark? So he would hone in on somebody he thought was a good kind of a classic mark.
Okay.
It's usually going to be a woman who looks like she's got money. Um, and he would invite her to his country home, or he would invite her for dinner, or he would invite to take her to the opera or whatever it might be. Um, and one way or another, he would get these women out to this house in Gombe. So this was a house that was a freestanding house.
Hmm.
And in France, in this type of neighborhood, you have these neighborhoods that have like actual really nice houses, and most of the time they're going to have some kind of a really heavy like foliage around them, like a really heavy shrubbery around them, or cast iron kind of wall, actually, like literally a kind of wall around it for privacy. Because even though the French are social creatures, they also love their privacy. Like I said, they like to be left alone. They want their quiet and privacy respected, and you don't ask people what's going on in your house. Why are your
Sure.
windows closed up? He was renting a house from a man who assumed that this was just like a nice, respectful gentleman.
Yeah.
And what he was actually doing is bringing the women to the house, and he killed them there.
Yeah.
And so he didn't get on the police radar for quite a long time. It started with a woman who gave a report to the police saying, "Hey, my sister was about to marry this gentleman. I think he had so many no, like nicknames and aliases that it was impossible to keep track of what his real name was. His real name was Nandu, but he had so many nicknames." And she said I think she's meant to marry this gentleman. I think he was called Pascal to her. And I haven't heard from her since.
Hmm.
So the police kind of they didn't take it too seriously uh, until they started getting another tip from another woman saying, "Hey, I haven't seen my friend or my sister or, a lady that lives next door."
Yeah.
And then they made they made the comparison between two different complaints at two different time frames.
Right.
And one was complaining about my sister's gone missing. She went off with a guy named Pascal. And the other
Yeah.
one is, my friend went missing and she went off with a man named, Pierre. I don't remember what it was, but they're like, the names don't match. But
Hmm.
one pretty clever detective spotted in the physical description, he said, "Boy, these physical descriptions are really similar."
Mhm.
That he's got the pointy beard and he's got this kind of frame and
Huh.
the top hat and all of that. So he decided to look more into it.
Wow.
And by this time, there was a third lady missing. And At some point, there was, I want to say the detective's name was Bélan. I'm going to say it's Bélan. He is the guy who actually started the Brigade du Tigre, which is the Brigade of Tigers.
Huh.
Oh, excuse me. The Brigade of Tigers. And he, excuse me, Mitch, can we edit this out? I had something go down the wrong way.
Oh, that's
Sorry.
fine. We just have the show. We just do the show straightforward. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, he started the Brigade du Tigre, which was a special, like, law enforcement force that was supposed to be like, like almost like a SWAT team.
Wow.
They were supposed to be the most highly trained and the best detectives. Yeah. So he got kind of obsessed with the case, and he wanted to find out what was going on. And he figured out through some paperwork what the real guy's name was, that it was Henri Landru. And somehow he was able to track Landru's address in Paris. And he was like, that's the guy, that's our guy. Mm-hmm. And this detective was so determined, he went to the extent of standing outside the address, the front door of the building, of Landru's building in Paris, overnight, waiting for the guy to show up. He spots Landru on the street. Landru goes inside, goes up to his apartment. Bélan follows him, but at a distance. And he's like, okay, I want to make sure I really catch him off guard. So I'm going to stay in the hallway of the apartment building all night. And this detective sat outside in the hallway outside of Landru's door. And finally he had, backup arrived.
Oh, yeah.
They go in and they get Landru, and there was a woman with him, which, probably was going to be his next victim.
That's right. Wow. Amazing story.
Yeah. So these detectives, they take him into custody. They're sure it's him. He's smug. He's arrogant. He's sarcastic. He's insolent. And they just, they can't get anything out of him.
Huh.
And under French law, they can only hold him for 24 hours. So they can't get anything out of him. And I think at that time they weren't able to really do anything. Wow. But they kept on his heels, and they were able to track down the house in Gambé that he was renting. The one that I mentioned, the freestanding one with lots of shrubbery around, a lot of privacy, perfect for a serial killer. So the cops start asking the neighbors about this guy. They're like, well, who is he? And he's going by a completely different name. They talk to his landlord, and he's going by a different name. And the neighbors tell the police, tell the detectives, that guy has been weird since day one. Okay. We don't know what's going on, but
something.
Yeah, he moved in, and he ordered a ton of coal, just straight coal. And we wondered, what is he using all of that coal for? Who needs that much coal for, no matter how cold the winter is, how much coal do you need? Because at this time they would still burn coal as a source of fuel and warmth. And, your stoves would be coal burning stoves. So other neighbors said, we noticed him coming in a lot with different women.
Yeah, wow.
And he seems to be quite a ladies' man, because he's always got a new girlfriend, a new lady. We've met them, they seem polite on that. So people had seen him with various victims, interacted with them, saying hello on the street or having a little, small talk outside the house. And then they say, oh, here's the funny thing though. We've noticed several times that he'll come in to the house with a new girlfriend, but when he leaves the house to go back to wherever, to go to wherever he goes, she's not with him. He goes in with a woman, comes out alone. So there's all these different, like, this constellation of data points that people knew there was something off. But because of this culture of minding your own business and don't ask too many questions, which I imagine, like, it would have been worse back then.
Yes.
It's still like that now, but I could say that, now you would probably have at least a couple of nosy neighbors going, "Okay, there's something not right. We're gonna go knock on the door. We're gonna ask the cops to check it out." It's a different world now. It's 100 years later. So 100 years ago, things were, much more French society was much, much more polite,
Oh,
distant, guarded. You didn't ask questions. You minded your own business. So the most alarming thing was that a number of the neighbors said that there's often a strange smell when we notice smoke coming from his chimney. We notice a strange smell. And the police officers said, "Well, what do you mean a strange smell?" And they say, "Well, some years back, there was an older guy in our village, like an elderly man. And I don't remember what his name was, but he had apparently fallen asleep in front of his fireplace one night. May have been, may have been drunk, maybe not, who knows. He fell asleep and he literally fell asleep and somehow fell like into the fireplace while it was burning, and he
wow.
was burned alive."
Wow.
And they remembered the smell that came up from that guy's chimney. It just filled the village. It just filled this little, this little small town or village, whatever you might call it. And they said, "So we have a kind of point of reference for the smell, and that's what we smell coming out of his house sometimes." This other guy, or Pascal or whatever. And the police thought, "Well, that's very interesting." So eventually they managed to, get inside, do a thorough search. So he was murdering the women inside the house.
Yeah.
He was able to then get their money, somehow misrepresent himself, and be able to like steal whatever wealth he could get out of them, dispose of their body in the furnace. And
Wow.
that's what those people were. They were
Right.
smelling the bodies of probably a dozen different victims that
like very close to the Gacey case in the Gacey and Dahmer cases in that sense.
Yeah, and it's really it's astonishing, at least in the Dahmer case, you can say, "Oh, that's a good one to."
Well, it's the same
In a way, but at least with the Dahmer case, you can say the neighbors complained. They complained about the smell.
Sure.
And they asked the landlord and other people, like, "Can you check out what's going on in this dude's apartment, because it smells terrible." But in the case of Landru, nobody asked, it's
Right.
only when the police come knocking, going, "What can you tell us about this guy?" Now they've got this laundry list of like all these weird things about him that kind of point to, we thought this was the guy, and this is definitely the guy. So so when you think about it, that was 100 years ago.
Right.
So you got to wonder, like, are there some people like this that have just never been caught and have been, did this their whole lives and then died, never got caught just because they hid the body so well,
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah,
because he could have gotten away with this forever if he had been a little more clever. The person that he makes me think of quite a bit, actually, would be H.H. Holmes, the Chicago serial killer. So H.H. Holmes operated during the late 1800s. And it was during the Chicago Fair. And he actually built a whole entire hotel that was designed with secret passages and secret torture rooms and secret little, dumb waiters and all kinds of weird things between the rooms and the walls, for the purpose of luring female guests to the hotel and then they would disappear inside the hotel.
Yeah.
And he had torture rooms, he had kill rooms in there. That's Chicago's most famous
Yeah.
serial killer, I think. That was kind of, it was a little bit before the time of JohnDouglas, but to think that, 100 plus years ago, we've got documented cases of people doing things that we can still find them doing today. So that's JohnDouglas. Any questions? Thoughts, questions, Mitch?
No, I would have questions if there were. I mean, I don't know. Questions about what? About who?
I can tell you, I think that the detective, I think the guy's a superhero in this case.
Like I do have a question. So what about? So clearly, this is an unvarying behavior. People killing, strangling, murdering. Males strangling, murdering, usually males. They're women. In the case of Sonny Bush, old, seniors, or close to senior age.
And usually,
hold on. So that's an unvarying behavior, whether it's 1880, 1912, or 1975, 1992. Those years vary. Those are totally different eras. But this is an unvarying behavior, right? So I guess what I'm wondering is, the obvious question is, what is the commonality over time of these behaviors, and what are the differences that the era provides, or motives different because the motive of somebody in 1990 ain't going to be the motive of somebody in 1890, or is it all the same? These are kind of things that I'm sure people.
I think I think that, you're right. Like, it's the same thing happening. And I'm willing to bet that we could probably go back to the Middle Ages or before that.
Right. Yeah.
And find that serial, it gets framed as a modern phenomenon. I don't know that that's true. I think that it's just that we had we saw an explosion of serial killers in the 70s through the 90s.
That's right.
And then it kind of something I haven't quite been able to figure out for myself. I don't know if you've thought about this, is why has the frequency and of serial killers dropped off so much since the late 90s? Late 90s seems to be where it kind of really just went. You don't see so many anymore. Either they're better at not getting caught, or there just aren't as many of them. Which is it? How can we know? Because the number of people who disappear never to be seen again, that hasn't changed too much, Well,
I would say, I don't know the answer to that. It is a good question. I really do think that the computer, AKA the internet, AKA the cell phone, changes everything. I do think that provides a level of surveillance, lack of privacy, that is just going to lessen those kind of criminal behaviors. It's just going to. So I do think there's less of it because of that. So I do chalk it up to the computer and the internet, just because first of all, people are spending their time with these little devices,
right?
And that's time they're not going to be murdering somebody.
That's a really good take.
Well, that's the only thing I can think of, because
they're too busy to kill people because they're doom scrolling.
or whatever. But that is the story of 2026, 2025. That's what mega is, a creation, I think, of the computer. The computer changed the character of one of the two major political parties in the United States. Made it suck and made it awful.
Yeah.
It has done many things, but maybe it's made people unable. Maybe it's made people less anonymous, but everybody's watching everything, and everybody's watching, also more aware of their neighbors and more nosy and more snoopy. There were movies, and all these things add up. So I do think the case, I could be wrong about that, but that's just the only thing that comes to my mind.
it does, but then, you don't you wonder too, though, like, was this phenomenon already, like, really kind of occurring at a similar rate? It's just that it didn't get. You don't think so? Like, yeah, I think the
I'm not. When I go, I'm not disagreeing with that as a possibility. I do think that. So in understanding what I would call sociological phenomenon, there's always been the two camps, right? The camp that says something always was always thus. This thing occurred. This thing was going on 150 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years. It's the unvarying camp, we'll call them. This is all serial killers. We always have among us. We always have a mafia. There's that camp, which is sort of, don't you think that we just didn't hear about it? But that's kind of that camp. Yeah. And then the other camp would be, and I plead, I don't know if guilty is the word, I'm more closer to this camp, which is the discontinuity camp. Behaviors emerged that did not really exist. Appear that did not that's Foucault's camp. Michel, a French scholar, says, people change from era to era. You get sexuality changes. The sexuality of people in 1987 will have very little in common with the sexuality of people in 1912. Just ain't going to be much in common. Forget your human nature. I'm caricaturing, but these are the two. And I guess if we apply that to serial killers, we could say, well, maybe there are eras in which there's not serial murder. And there are eras in which serial murder comes to prominence, like the 1970s and the 80s. I guess, those are the two.
I'm thinking that, okay, I think that there was a spike in serial killers starting about like late 60s, early 70s. Right. And I think it's because more people just had cars.
Yeah, more people had cars, and
you can get around to places where you're not surveilled. Yeah, you're just not surveilled, And obviously, somebody like Landru, in the early 1900s in Paris, you're just not surveilled. There's no cameras everywhere, and I think probably, just the rise of automobiles and any kind of vehicle like a van, just like the ability to own one or rent one. Usually own, but, just the ability to have a vehicle to get around, to stalk your victim, to abduct your victim, to drive your victim around to a wooded area, to put your victim's body in the trunk and find a place to dispose of it. All of those things, like, they're really connected to cars.
Sure, sure. And of course,
yeah.
But also, I mentioned those two camps. There are trends. So I remember I was trained in the 80s into the 90s in a certain point of view, because that was what was dominant in the humanities at that time, and that point of view was skeptical about psychology, human nature arguments. That was more the that was the high point, postmodernism, social constructionism, or, that was the high point of there is no human nature. Humans change from year to year radically. Don't try to say that there's an unvarying. As you guess from we're in the opposite. So right now the trend is towards evolutionary psychology. That there is a human nature. Males do this. Females. We're at the peak of the opposite view now. We dominate now, for better or for worse, and that's just where we are. So those are trends and explanation. So if you look around and see the explanations that are given by reporters, by the media, they would tend to look at, there's this thing within males that make them do this, unfortunately, you could see it in 1880, you could see it in 1912, you could see it in Gacey, and this is a thing. Right. I leave aside the truth or the falsity of any of these explanations. I'm just saying they're trends.
I think, again, you can't talk about serial killers without talking about motive. So, what we know about, all of the literature about Landru, and I've seen some people write about him who do suspect that he had a psychosexual motive as well, that it wasn't purely financial, but we can't know. He never.
Well, we can only know. Well, you say we can't know, but if somebody look, if somebody is just robbing women or taking money from them only, right? We could say that their motive is they're kind of a con artist.
They're a con artist, but most
if they're raping and murdering women, that tells us that that's not.
We don't know if he raped them. That's the thing.
Okay,
we don't know because he burned them. He would never.
I'm sorry. Well, yeah.
The theory is that the police theory is that he strangled them, probably, but nobody really knows because he burned the bodies. There was almost like
what you're saying. We literally can't know. It could have just been a financial crime.
Could have been,
There's a lot to go through to burn a body's a lot to do. I mean, that's a. I don't want to rule out that person enjoys doing that, and that's.
You've got cases of, for example, there are, some cases of female serial killers where, there was like a case, I think it was California, where she took in basically indigent men and said, I'll give you a roof over your head and I'll give you, meals. She killed them and buried them in the front yard and continued collecting their disability checks or their social security checks. In that case, there's a very clear financial motive. But with Landru, there had to, I think, because I do think there was some kind of misogyny there, as there always is. It's, using love and romance, kind of a romance scam on a woman to get her money, and then you kill her and burn her body. Like, that just tells you, like, she's just literally trash to him, You see this now too, but more people now can scam somebody without killing them. So I tend to think there has to be some. I think that his motive was more. I think his motive had to have some kind of very deep misogyny and not just simply financial gain. That's my theory.
So I'm partly right on that. I was just a guess. I don't, I only make my best guess, and this is not my. That's a period I don't know as well. I mean, certainly know, I've read Proust's novel and I know things about that period, but I don't know anything. I barely know the facts of the Dreyfus affair, which is a same period. But I know a little bit about that. I mean, that was Leon Blum, and you could look at French history, French.
I'd like to move on to talking a little bit about not a French. I'm gonna end with a very Parisian case, the most Parisian serial killer case I think that's on the books.
Wow.
But I'm going to start with talking about I'm going to go on to talk a little bit about Marc Dutroux, who was Belgian. So he was he was a French-speaking Belgian, and this is a much more recent case. And I figure I can throw him in with the Frenchies because he was a native French speaker. So Dutroux operated in Belgium, and now the thing about this guy, if you look at pictures of him and stuff, good looking guy. You'd never look at this dude and go, he's a monster. He just like a nice looking man.
What year is this? What years was this?
Recent. I want to say the early 2000s.
That's really. It's like now, yeah.
Oh, it's very, very recent, yeah. He is 69 now. So, let's see. He operated in Brussels, I believe, and yeah, he was found guilty in 2004. Now, here's the thing about his operation. I'm going to call it an operation. First of all, he had a long history of being a sexual sadist.
Okay.
He was a sexual sadist. He had a long and weird and creepy history of, he was a psychopath and a sexual sadist. So he got married to a woman who, for all intents and purposes, if you just looked at them on the street or met them at a party or something, you'd have no indication that anything was wrong with
Mm.
either of these people. But the family knew better, and I'm just trying to find her name because the wife has something to do with this. Okay,
Wow.
so he just to give you a little background, he was born in 56.
Mm.
So he's of that generation that's kind of, I guess that would make him a boomer, like kind of
Yes.
a younger-ish boomer.
Yeah.
But when he was younger, he was a nice looking man. Like when he was operating as a, monster. Okay, so he had two accomplices, Michel Martin,
Oh, wow.
and she basically she was like the Ghislaine Maxwell of his.
Wow.
That's why I made the connection between Epstein
Yeah.
and Dutroux. Okay, so to let you know what Dutroux did, he they bought a house and he converted the basement of the house to a prison. Basically, not even like a proper prison with like as a room, but like more like a cage. I should call them cages, human cages.
Oh my
So
God.
when I say house, you're probably picturing like an American style house, but this would be in a city, and in a city like Brussels, which I think that's where the place was.
Mm.
Brussels is a big. It's a fairly modern city. Brussels. It's got its Art Deco and Art Nouveau houses, but it's also got a lot of modern builds. And so he lived in a kind of house that was like attached to other buildings. And when I say house, so that basement was right on the street. It was like right facing the street. You've been to Paris, so you know this type of building where you might have like a basement that has like a window.
Yeah.
Like if you're in the basement, there might be a window that can see out to the street. It would have been a space like that.
Okay.
But he covered up all those windows and he turned that space of the house into human cages.
Oh my God.
Simply, the wife and anybody else was told, you're not allowed to go down there. But she knew what was going on. She helped in whatever he told her to do. He lured little girls. He lured 12 and 13-year-old girls.
Wow.
He kept them down there, caged, no sunlight, very little food, no proper toilet facilities, no nothing. And he tortured and raped them repeatedly until he either killed them or let them, on occasion, he would let them starve to death. Like, imagine that. So you've never, I can take you've not heard of this case before.
Absolutely not. No knowledge of it. This is quite shocking.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it was known that this guy had a very long history of, just being a dirtbag. People did complain, like the parents went to the police and said, my daughter's missing. My daughter, first case that got reported were two little girls. I want to say they were like 9 and 10. They were very, very young. And the father of one of the girls went to the police and said, I have not seen my daughter. She's been gone for more than 24 hours. And the police said, oh, we don't think it's that important. They didn't do anything. They just kind of didn't take it seriously. And they continued to not take these parents' complaints seriously. One inspector literally went to the house to check it out and could hear voices. And he asked Dutroux during the tour of the house, what are those voices? And Dutroux says to him, oh, it's just like neighbors. Yeah, our neighbors are really loud, or it's like voices outside. And the detective just goes, oh, okay, and leaves. And the whole time the girls are down there. So he does finally get caught. He does finally get discovered, and two girls, thank God, these two last girls were alive. Somehow they survived. They became, real like avatars for the other girls that did not make it. But here's the thing. When they went to DNA testing from the mattresses that the girls were being kept on, they found DNA profiles for about 26 different males.
Huh?
What does that tell you? So, in effect, it wasn't just Dutroux kink. A
Yeah.
lot of people believe that this was part of
He was being used.
an underground sex trafficking
Right, it's a traffic.
children for elites. And
Yeah.
that this is why a lot of this case got shoved under the carpet and ignored by the police and told, oh, it's not, it's not real, it's not really happening. And of course it was. So to this day, many, many people, I tend to be one of them. I think that this was part of a bigger operation.
Okay.
I think that he was being protected for a long time because the way he moved through his life and through his activities, there were very many people who said it was like he didn't even care who caught him with these two girls. We saw him with these girls, we saw him with that girl, we know what he did. And they didn't do anything about it because a lot of people think that the police and other higher ups were in on it. So that's Belgium.
That is, yeah, I didn't.
It's nuts, right? So the last case I'm going to tell you about, and I'll try to keep this one short because I know we're running out of time. So the one that to me kind of resonates the most because I live here and I frequent all of the neighborhoods that this guy operated in. His name was Guy Georges. Okay, so a little bit about Guy. Guy Georges. And Georges was not his birth name. Nobody knows what his birth name was because he was actually the son born to a white French woman and a Black American military man. And this would have been, I guess, he must be around my age by now. He was born in 62, actually, so he's 63. So we're talking about like early 1960s France, still a very, this country is rather conservative and traditional and people think that all of France is Paris, and it couldn't be farther from the truth. So Guy was born to a young mother and a young Black serviceman, and I mentioned that he's Black because that comes into that ends up mattering because the girl was white, and the girl's family did not like it at all that she was pregnant by a Black man.
Right.
She has the child, and they immediately put the child into foster care or an orphanage, something of the sort, because this little, Black child was considered an embarrassment and a disgrace and all of this kind of thing. It's an extremely racist environment that the child is born into. So I feel for the child that's born into this. However, as the kid gets older, he starts to display conduct disorder pretty early in life. He kind of gets bounced around for a while, but then he ends up in a foster home that's quite loving. Like, even by his own later admission, this was quite a loving environment. They really cared for him. And however, he started to show aggressive tendencies yet again as he's getting more into like age 13, 14, 15, 16. And finally at age 16, this family also says, we can't take it anymore. Like, he's got too many behavioral problems. He's making the other children scared. And we are going to have to give him back to the state. So, unfortunately, as we said, there's always something wrong in the childhood. There's always something that goes horribly awry in childhood when someone turns out like this. So Guy turns out to be quite an antisocial, violent person. He's got convictions for many different kinds of offenses: robbery, assault, attempted rape, you name it. He gets convicted for rape at one point in his early 20s, I believe. And he goes to jail for about 5 months and then gets out. for rape with a knife. This is where like, you can see where the laws have been too lax in some cases. Eventually he's out, he's free again, and he's constantly doing these kind of petty or, more petty crimes like theft and minor assaults, fights, that kind of thing. Well, his stomping ground is kind of the east and central east parts of Paris, like around Bastille, like Place de Bastille is where that you've seen, you know what it looks like, the Bastille Tower, that little like phallic symbol there. It's, in the 11th arrondissement, like, so the 11th arrondissement is like one of the most populated, important, popular arrondissements. And that was his stomping ground. And what he would do is basically just like he'd spot a woman on the street that he liked the look of. He would stalk her on the street. And if she went into a parking garage, which was sometimes the case, he would approach her in the parking garage. And this is always at nighttime. And he carried a very specific Opinel knife that was pretty long and big and something that you would use to, like, chop up a chicken. And he would use this knife to hold them, captive and eventually kill them. So the first killing, I think, was in a parking garage where he forced her into her own car, raped her at knife point, and then cut her up and left her there on the floor of the parking garage. He goes on to kill, I want to say it's 11 women, maybe 7, between 7 and 11. And, this isn't the kind of serial killer that's driving. He doesn't have a car. So all of his activity is either on foot or by metro or by bus. Mostly it was on foot.
Right.
And, this isn't the kind of serial killer that's like, finding you in the woods. He's ringing your doorbell. So in a number of other cases, he stalked young women up to their apartments, did the same thing, same modus operandi. It's always rape and then murder. And sometimes with some torture involved too. And if you look at the pictures of the victims, I'm gonna guess that they resemble his birth mother. That would be my guess, because they all seem to be kind of very slim, dark-haired, and the idea, like, sometimes when I'm walking around Bastille, it's, I get a kind of chill, like, down my spine thinking that guy walked here. This is the street where he, followed this woman. That's the building he went up in. I just have a weird mind like that. It's not like I'm not getting off on it or anything, but it just, I'm always aware, because Paris still, in parts of Paris still, feels sketchy and dangerous. Going down into the metro station, and certain metro stations at night feel quite dangerous if you're a woman alone. So I think about these women, they were all alone. They all felt safe. Most of them were students or shop girls or, just young women with their lives ahead of them, cut short by this guy who was just like, had such a chip on his shoulder. And he did get caught. They did finally catch him. They had put out so many different, like, sketches, like some matched how he looked, some really didn't at all. And they finally got some good, like, intel, and they were able to find him, and he denied everything in the beginning. And then he admitted, he finally realized, they've got all the goods on me. And the thing is, this was the early days of DNA. And at the time in France, you weren't quite allowed to use DNA the way we were able to use it liberally in the US. We were much more ahead of our time with DNA in the US. Here, they put a lot of restrictions on it because there's always these privacy concerns here. So France, when they're looking at a new policy or new law or anything like that, a huge part of what they're looking at is, does this respect individual privacy rights? So they were starting to see that this could be very dangerous in terms of privacy. In the end, they did use the DNA. And what really sucks is that they had his DNA off of 2 victims. They didn't catch him at that time. And then at some point when they suspected him of a different crime, he wasn't yet suspected of those two couple of murders. They got a blood test from him. They got a blood sample, and they said, okay, well, it matches the crime that they were going after. That was the rape, I think.
Wow.
They didn't compare it against those two murders because they just didn't have communication between jurisdictions and police departments at that time. Mm-hmm. And then he ended up killing two other women. So it's like those two women may have still been alive if they had compared that blood sample to the semen samples that they found in the other apartments. He is still, I believe, serving out his sentence. And by the way, so is Marc Dutroux, I think, is still serving out his sentence. So, sometimes we catch them and sometimes they're stopped. But yeah, the Guy Georges case is the one that's always kind of blown my mind because it's happening in a city like this. And it's hard to imagine today somebody getting away with what Guy Georges did because of surveillance, because of phones and CCTV and cameras everywhere now. He couldn't have done that today, thankfully. So I think you're right, Mitch. I think that, technology has kind of put the lid on some of this stuff.
Yeah, it's just off the top of my head kind of theory. It's not.
No, I think it makes perfect sense. I do like the idea that people are just like they're done with murder because they're on their phones. Scrolling cat memes.
I mean, that's a change in social reality, right?
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
Deb, I really appreciate your knowledge of France and and Belgium and bringing that to this part too, because I really it's a big topic, It
is, yeah. It's very, like I said, it's really hard. I could have covered 12 different cases on here. I actually had 12 cases, but I kind of picked the 3 that I felt were, most kind of relevant to our understanding of serial murder today.
Yeah.
Because, like, for example, there was one during World War I, and he was killing, I think he was killing Jews, like, in his house, and that was clearly more motivated by anti-Semitism, not by, psychosexual urges or anything like that. But yeah, as usual, the psychosexual urges, they seem to be the top motivating factor.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's a big topic. In fact, it's so large, and there's so much to France and what you brought to this episode. I think we might conclude there.
Yeah, thank you.
Because well, I'm going to ask you this before we conclude. Is there anything that comes into your mind? Do you think that it's possible that this kind of crime will disappear? It's possible.
No, never.
There always will be somebody doing spirit. Not ever.
I think that you could put some kind of some kind of alarm device on every single human being on the planet that alerts the authorities to, hey, this person is doing a serial killing. And you'd still have people doing it. Because I think there are some people who just cannot. They're so driven by dark urges that they can't stop themselves. I think that's a big part of it. That, if they could stop themselves, some of these people, when they get caught, they say, I'm glad you caught me because I wouldn't have stopped.
Kept doing it.
Yeah. No, I don't think it will ever stop. I think it will evolve somehow. And I think it's interesting to note how technology plays a role in this. Yeah. Things like, technology, mass transportation, cars, all of this stuff plays some role in how this particular crime evolves.
Yeah. It's part of life, as we said in the last episode, they walk among us. And then
they walk among us.
They will continue to walk among us unfortunately. But thank you for your generosity and your
thanks for having me on.
Research, which is considerable.
Thank you.
And be safe.
Thank you, you too. All right, Mitch. Till next time.